Thank you, Carly. And thank you, everybody, for joining today to our panel, Trans Students in Higher Education, Current Challenges and Pathways to Inclusion. Colleges that embrace diversity and equity as educational values have a responsibility to buffer students from threats to their safety, to protect their privacy, and to ensure that their students can focus on learning. And yet, in the present time, transgender students are facing multi-pronged attacks from state legislatures, social media, and hate groups. I am joined today by three incredible co-panelists, Shayna, Jenny, and Kai, who will answer the question, what action steps can schools take to affirm and support the more than 200,000 transgender students enrolled in schools of higher education across this country who are attempting to learn and to better themselves through their studies? How can we support them in this volatile climate? After sharing a few facts and figures from the experiences of trans students in higher ed from the Williams Institute project that we conducted with the Point Foundation, I will turn panel moderation over to Annie Knox, who is the Associate Dean of Administration at the University of Redlands. Next. So I'm going to share a few findings next from the Access to Higher Education survey. This was a project that we conducted at the beginning of the pandemic, early in 2021, with a sample of 18 to 40-year-olds, representative US sample, and we included in there a small but representative group of transgender students, people ages 18 to 40, who some of whom were currently enrolled in school, and others told us about their experiences in higher education at different points in the life course. So what's important to remember about this group of students, and I'm going to share some findings from the study with you, is that 1 in 5 had ever attended vocational programs. 40% or so had been to community college, and almost 60% had attended a four-year college. So when we think about transgender students, we have to remember that they're not all in four-year colleges. We know that they are also diverse in terms of their gender identity, their race, ethnicity, and at this point in time, many transgender young people are also sexual minorities. So they are in school in a lot of places, and they have very diverse characteristics themselves. It's also important to remember that when students go to schools of higher education, they go with some history, and this is what the suitcase represents. We found in our project that 1 in 5 transgender students picked a school in a different city or state from where they grew up. And this is, again, early in 2021 when we did this project, because they thought it would be more welcoming of someone like them. Now, this is particularly significant because we know from high school-based surveys that more than a third of transgender youth have experienced bullying in high schools, that more than a third of transgender youth have attempted suicide in the prior 12 months among the high school sample. So we know that youth have experienced a lot of adversity at schools before they even attempt to go to schools of higher education. Sometimes they experience rejection from families. And even before the legislative bans started ramping up, many were also seeking refuge when they were looking for schools of higher education. Next slide. So here are some findings, key findings from the project. In terms of safety and outness, 1 in 7 felt unsafe. These are transgender students across different educational environments. 44% were not out to teachers, faculty, or program staff about being LGBTQ. About a third were not out to other students. About a third reported unfair treatment by teachers, staff, or school administrators. More than a third experienced bullying, harassment, or assault. And not surprisingly, in terms of mental health, more than half of transgender students in higher education reported that their mental health, which includes stress, depression, and problems with emotions, was not good all or most of the time when they were in school. So for a group of people who are seeking to better themselves in schools of higher ed, who've already experienced, many of them, adversity in high school and are seeking refuge in schools of higher ed, these findings for me are somewhat sad and disappointing. And as far as how they relate to the experiences of other LGBTQ students who are cisgender experiences, our trans students are a little bit more out than other LGBTQ students. The unfair treatment, violence, and harassment is sort of similar, but mental health is much worse for trans students. About a third of LGBTQ students as a whole report poor mental health while they were in school, and about 10% of non-LGBTQ students reported poor mental health in terms of the time that they were in school. So why this is, we can talk about a little bit later on in the panel. Next. So once in school, this slide shows us the kinds of LGBTQ and in particular trans resources that students experienced or found when they were in school. And you can see that across school environments, very few schools are offering LGBTQ supportive counseling services, which you would think would be particularly important given the adversity that people are experiencing. Or, 1 in 5 will say that their health services were LGBTQ informed. Gender inclusive housing was reported by about 1/3 of the trans students in this particular project. And again, it's a probability sample, so we think this is probably representative of what other folks are experiencing. And again, and at the low end, only 1 in 5 transgender people said their school included an option to designate a process, at least to change their gender pronouns on administrative records. So next slide. How does all of this impact the cumulative experiences that folks have across primary, secondary school, and then getting into schools of higher education? Well, 3 times as many transgender respondents as our cisgender LGBTQ respondents indicated that lifetime school-based unfair treatment, harassment, or bullying due to being LGBTQ was a barrier to their academic success. So here we have about 1 in 4 transgender people are saying that the experiences they have impacted their academic success, and very similar findings were observed in relation to getting the amount of education, training, or degrees that they wanted. And so the folks that we've collected data from have expressed that the experiences that they've had have taken a toll on the quality of education, the amount of education that they are receiving. Next. And with that, I'm going to turn the mic over to Annie, who's going to take over as our panel moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kareth. It's my pleasure to introduce our first panelist today. Shana Medley is a litigation staff attorney with the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. Prior to TELDEF, Shana was a legal fellow with the Center for Reproductive Rights at the ACLU LGBT and HIV Project and served as a law clerk on the Southern District of Ohio. In addition to litigation, Shana has taught law school courses at Harvard Law School and Cardozo School of Law and published several law review articles on gender discrimination. Thank you so much for joining us, Shana.
Thank you so much, Annie. So we wanted to begin with setting the scene in broad strokes about the legal landscape for trans and non-binary youth and young people. So, obviously with our time today, we don't have time to sort of go into all of the specific legislation targeting trans youth, but I wanted to talk about some of the major categories of anti-trans legislation that are impacting students. We can go to the next slide. So I'm sure many of you are aware there's been a big increase in bills targeting access to transgender healthcare for young people. And so this map from the Williams Institute shows states where bills have been introduced and passed targeting gender-affirming care. Next slide. So even though these bills do not directly deal with higher education, of course, healthcare is necessary to living the rest of our lives. And when trans young people are worried about getting access to care, it impacts their experiences in schools. So the Williams Institute estimates 156,000 transgender youth approximately live in states where gender affirming care has been restricted or in jeopardy. Most of these restrictions target youth under 18, though some go up to age 26, or even target adults, like Missouri's recent ban, though that ban was recently enjoined. And accessing care is already difficult, even in less hostile states, and trans students entering college may face disruptions in accessing care, particularly if they're going out of state. And so this hostile legislative climate just exacerbates an already challenging circumstance by impacting students' physical and mental health, right, in terms of actually being able to access care that they need if they're in an impacted state. And also just, the impact on students' mental health from this climate. So, a recent study by the Trevor Project showed 93% of trans youth worry about access to gender affirming care. Next slide. So another category I wanted to talk about was bills targeting students' ability to participate in sex-separated programs and activities. Another big category of anti-trans bills that we're seeing are states attempting to limit or ban students' ability to participate in athletics consistent with their gender identity. Like a lot of the healthcare bans, a lot of these bans have also been enjoined by courts. The litigation is ongoing. So, the status of the bills varies state to state and will continue to change. And in addition to sports bans, we're also seeing a few states reintroduce anti-trans bathroom bills. So we saw a lot of these a few years ago. Pretty much across the board were struck down by courts, but I think opponents of trans rights have been emboldened by the recent Supreme Court to try to pass some of these types of laws again. I think in the Q&A I'll talk a little bit about the Title IX regulation, so I'll skip that for now since I think we're going to get to it later. We can go to the next slide. So the final category of bills I wanted to mention impacting students is around speech and privacy. So, and people have probably heard of the Don't Say Gay or Trans laws impacting students as well as teachers and administrators' ability to speak about LGBTQ content. Some states have also introduced bills attempting to force staff to misgender students or out students to parents against their will. All of which are deeply concerning. We can go to the next slide. So all of these bills have serious constitutional implications and should be struck down in court, but depending on state and what judge they're in front of, what circuit court they're in, the law, federal law, constitutional law might not be consistently applied, right? But that said, it's important to understand federal law, for students to know their rights and to be able to robustly enforce them. So, the number of bans and statutes targeting trans students is frightening. It absolutely impacts students in their day-to-day lives. Don't want to downplay that in any way. But at the same time, there's a lot more bills introduced than actually get passed. And many of the ones that do get passed are enjoined by courts or in the process of litigation. And, one of the goals behind these bills is just to scare people, to threaten people into complying with them, even when they're blatantly unconstitutional. So knowing your rights and knowing the status of these laws is really important. For example, had a pop culture reference that I just read yesterday. The artist Haley Kiyoko talked about how she was performing in Tennessee. She was planning to bring drag queens on stage with her during the performance. And she posted a video talking about how she was threatened by law enforcement because of Tennessee's drag ban, that, they might face consequences for putting on this show. And she talked about how she, met with the drag queens and they decided to go forward. I don't know if Kaylee Kyoko had a legal team, but I like to imagine she probably had a lawyer who also advised her that the Tennessee drag ban has actually been enjoined, which means a judge has said that it cannot be enforced for the time being because it likely violates the First Amendment. So no one should have been threatened with enforcement of this law under the injunction. And so, I think that's just an example of how knowing your rights and knowing the status of these laws is important for students to navigate this really terrifying terrain. So I wanted to mention a non-exhaustive list of a few of the federal and constitutional laws that do protect trans and non-binary students. So Title IX is a federal law that prohibits sex discrimination in educational programs or activities that receive federal financial assistance. Also requires schools to respond to sex-based harassment and bullying, which many courts have interpreted to include anti-trans discrimination. Likewise, 14th Amendment of the Constitution, Equal Protection Clause, prohibits sex discrimination, including sex stereotyping. The First Amendment protects speech about LGBTQ issues, protects freedom of association, including things like creating LGBTQ student groups, and has been interpreted to protect expression, including, dress and the way that you present yourself. HIPAA is a federal law protecting the privacy of students' medical records. Typically, it applies to providers and not to schools, but it can provide rights in terms of what your providers can disclose to your schools. And FERPA is a federal law that covers schools receiving federal funding, protecting against the disclosure of certain confidential information. And the National Association of Secondary School Principals has issued a statement that interprets FERPA's protection of personally identifiable information to include things like transgender status, legal name, and sex assigned at birth, and cautions that disclosure of that kind of information to other staff or parents could violate students' rights. Students also have federal protections around disability. So IDEA provides funding to schools to support students with disabilities. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination in places of public accommodation, including colleges and universities. Many courts have interpreted the ADA to cover gender dysphoria, and so schools have an obligation to provide reasonable accommodations and prevent discrimination. Next slide. And so beyond federal law and constitutional law, there are also individual states and localities that have more protections. So, I know a lot of the focus has been on these bad bills, and there are certainly states where, students are at risk, and also states that have protections that go beyond federal law. So this is a map from the Movement Advancement Project, which folks can look up and, check out what individual state and local laws might give students even more protection on the basis of things like sexual orientation and gender identity. Next slide. And so from a legal perspective, I wanted to give folks a few kind of takeaways on what students, families, and schools can do. So again, just empowering students to know their rights and engage in advocacy with school administrators. Documenting harassment and discrimination is really important to enforcing rights. So, keeping detailed notes on names and dates and conversations that you have with school staff is really important if you do want to bring a lawsuit down the line. Advocating for training, professional development for school staff and administrators about compliance with the laws that do protect trans students and the needs of trans students. Also harnessing the power of social media, the press, and student activism often can be a lot more effective and quicker than litigation. So those have seemed to be really effective tools. And again, just robustly enforcing federal, state, and local anti-discrimination protections, reaching out to local LGBT groups and legal groups to better understand the jurisdictional law in your particular state and area. So with that, I will wrap up my portion. I will turn things back over to Annie.
Thank you so much, Shana. Our next panelist is Dr. Jenny Beeman. the director of the UMass Amherst Stonewall Center, and the coordinator of Campus Pride's Trans Policy Clearinghouse. They have published and spoken extensively on the experiences and needs of trans college students, including writing some of the first articles on the topic. Among the more than dozen books and journal issues that Jenny has written and or edited are The Lives of Transgender People with Sue Rankin, 2011, A Queer Capital, A History of a Gay Life in Washington, D.C., 2014, and the anthology Trans People in Higher Education, 2019. With Abby Goldberg, they edited the Sage Encyclopedia of Trans Studies, 2021, and are an associate editor of the forthcoming second generation of the Sage Encyclopedia of LGBTQ Studies. Thank you so much for joining us, Jenny.
Thank you. It's great to be here. So I've been doing research and advocacy around the needs of trans and non-binary college students for 25 years now, trying to get colleges to be more supportive. And it's amazing to see the changes that have just taken place in the last few years. One of those changes is the explosion of students who are identifying as trans and non-binary. You see on this slide, just in less than 6 years, we've more than tripled the percent of students, college students, who are identifying as trans or non-binary. If this trend was to keep up at this rate, in about 10 years, every college student would be trans or non-binary. Not that I expect that to happen, but it just shows you the ways in which the numbers are just really phenomenally increasing. Next slide, please. Almost all of this increase are students who are identifying as non-binary. And this data comes from the American College Health Association's National College Health Assessment. Next slide. This sort of graphs it out, looking at non-binary versus trans women, trans men. Not to create a dichotomy here, but if you were to look at it from that perspective, you just see here the overwhelming number of students who are identifying as non-binary versus trans women, trans men. A huge shift from what it was a decade ago, and certainly incredibly different than what it was 30 years ago when I first started identifying as non-binary and didn't know anyone else who identified as non-binary. Now it's a very, very common experience, especially among Gen Z, and we're seeing as well among Gen Alpha. Next slide, please. This is from my own research involving the Common App, which is the admission form used by more than 1,000 colleges. This past year had more than 1.2 million students fill it out. So working with that huge data set, you see here that the vast majority of students who are identifying as non-binary were assigned female at birth. You also see here trans men versus trans women. On the Common App, it's almost twice as many trans men than trans women. And on the National College Health Assessment, it is twice the percent. It still is not safe for individuals who are assigned male at birth to identify outside of the very narrow expectations of what it is to be male or to be a man. It's very different. It's very much changed. When I started doing research 25 years ago on trans people, it was a very common experience for individuals who are trans to be coming out in midlife. They would repress who they were. They were very afraid to be open about who they were. And it wasn't until they started getting to about midlife and reevaluating their lives and seeing this wasn't really working out, that they really weren't who people thought they were and wanted to really be authentic to themselves. that's really changed for individuals assigned female at birth. That is still, unfortunately, a very common experience for individuals assigned male at birth. It just is not the room to be anything other than male. Hopefully that's going to change, and there is some changing that now, but it's still very difficult for individuals assigned male at birth to identify as non-binary or as female. Next slide. So as I say, I work with the Common App. This past fall was the first year they asked gender after a decade of me advocating for them to do so. They got some new leadership, some really great people, and they decided to do it. You see here the results of that. More than 3,500 students wrote in a gender and provided what I count to be about 130 different genders. Pretty phenomenal. At the same time, though, there were some pretty common genders that people wrote in. You see here the most common ones, the most common being gender fluid, which is also very different than what it was, say, 5 years ago, when you would have seen gender queer being the most common. Now gender fluid really captures a lot of how younger people see themselves, not wanting to be sort of boxed in, but to be able to express their gender in a variety of different ways. And you see here, looking at race differences, that white students were a little bit more likely to identify as trans or non-binary than students of color. Students of color were at the average. But you see here as well, international students were far less to identify as trans or non-binary, and we're also far less likely to be using pronouns other than he or she for themselves. Next slide. Talking about pronouns, about 3% of students on the Common App use pronouns other than just she or he, and you see here the percentages. She and they being the most common, which reflects again the fact that those who are identifying as non-binary, 80% were assigned female at birth. If you add up all the folks who use they, them, either as their only pronoun set or as one of their pronoun sets, you see you capture almost everyone with that. But at the same time, there's also a great deal of diversity here, 78 different pronoun sets, about 146 different pronoun combinations. So it's important to ask how people identify and understand that there are a whole host of different pronouns out there. Next slide. So other research I do looks at the experiences of non-binary students. And when I do this research, invariably, non-binary students say that their colleges don't do very well by them, that they largely fail them. Biggest area is a lack of gender inclusive bathrooms. All buildings on campus should have gender inclusive bathrooms. There should be no gendered single stall bathrooms on a college campus. Simply do away with them. And we need to also have multi-stall gender inclusive bathrooms, because single stall, just unless you're going to build a whole host of them, isn't going to be enough to satisfy the need. Also, I need to have on websites so students know where those are. Pronouns were another big thing, needing to have pronouns so that people were not being misgendered when it comes to class rosters and administrative systems. The fact that misgendering is harassment if it's ongoing, and it's a violation of Title IX. Next slide. Having the name you go by, having your gender identity reflected on records as well was really important to students. It's important that we have any non-legal record have the name that a student uses for themselves, and if there's a gender marker there, that it reflect the gender of the person. But again, so few schools really provide this kind of thing. Housing, we need to be assigning housing based upon how students identify themselves. Students be able to live with whoever they want to live with, wherever they want to live with. If you live off campus, of course, you can live with whoever you want to live with. Why do we enforce a gender binary on campus and expect students to live with certain people? Makes no sense. Gender inclusive housing is important, but really it's a small step forward in trying to address the needs of non-binary students. Next slide. Lack of healthcare was also something a lot of students have mentioned in my research. The need for colleges to provide adequate, accessible mental health care, provide HRT on campus or in local community where that's permissible, and covered by insurance. And then the last piece that people pointed out a lot in my research was the need to educate so that people are doing right by trans and non-binary students. It's one thing to have really good policies in place. It's another thing to make sure those policies are carried out and people are acting accordingly. So it's important that there be education and not just trying to get good policy in place. Next slide. And then my last slide here is the importance, given the environment we're in now, that colleges need to become sanctuaries for trans and non-binary students. In what I call the trans hate states, they need to do their best to be protecting their students, being sort of oases in a sea of hatred, and really be sending a message in various ways that they value and welcome trans students, and be engaged in legal fights to protect the rights of trans students. You know, step up to the plate, walk the walk, and don't just talk the talk. And then in friendlier states, need to reach out to those students in hate states, give them an opportunity to come to your college. Good example, New College of Florida, which has sort of become DeSanto College, with the governor of Florida taking over the board of trustees, appointing the president, and making it into a ultra conservative institution. My colleague institution down the road, Hampshire College, which is another small, very progressive liberal arts college, reached out to students at New College and said, hey, we know what you're going through there. If you want to come up to Hampshire, we'll provide you in-state tuition rates. Fantastic that they're doing that, to give students an opportunity who can escape from that kind of environment, which is just so oppressive, to be able to do so. So we need to be doing those kind of things. And I'll end here.
Thank you so much, Jenny. Our final panelist today, Kai Huang, is currently a first-year student at the University of California, San Francisco School of Medicine in their program for medical education, Urban Underserved, a 5-year track for students dedicated to providing healthcare to urban underserved communities. They are also a current Point Foundation flagship scholar. Kai graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2021, where Z held student leadership and advocacy roles in student affairs, healthcare, and residential life. Prior to starting medical school, Kai worked as a health educator at the Center for Trans Youth Health and Development at the Children's Hospital, Los Angeles, where Z co-facilitated a leadership program for trans youth of color, taught trans-centered sexual health education, and provided resource referrals to trans and non-binary youth. Thank you so much for joining us, Kai.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, my camera is doing something. Thank you for having me. So yeah, today I'm just going to be talking about my experience as a student and how universities can support students. If possible, I have asked the host to make a poll to ask how many attendees here are students, staff, faculty, or other, just to get a better sense of who's here today. But yeah, right now I am a medical student at UCSF School of Medicine, and I'm on leadership for Pride in Medicine, or Pride Med, our student org for LGBTQ medical students. I've been doing a lot of medical education advocacy, hoping to improve the curriculum and make it more inclusive, representative, accurate, and respectful for trans and non-binary people, intersex people, and just in general. I think that in terms of ways that universities and colleges can support students, often comes back to just creating spaces that can be supportive. So for example, this can look like, you just, you know, having LGBTQ centers or other student affairs type centers, or even just like creating one-off spaces. When I worked at the LGBTQ center at UCLA, we had one-off discussion spaces. And so that's something that can be done in a like supportive way. So students can run those spaces and faculty can or staff can support and kind of book rooms or ensure that students have like a space that's just for them to be social or have discussions or meet and plan for advocacy, whatever they may need that for. So for example, at UCLA, I co-founded the Student Advocacy Committee at the LGBTQ Center, and that was with support of the LGBT Center staff. So that is something that within the context of that structure, we were able to create spaces where as students, we could meet and talk about the issues that we were experiencing and brainstorm, how do we address these? Who do we need to have meetings with? What next steps would we like to take? And this was really helpful structure for us. And it doesn't require a lot of physical space. We were meeting on Zoom. This was during the pandemic, really. And it really was helpful because a lot of the times I find that students were very isolated. We maybe don't have the ongoing structural support in order to do advocacy or find social spaces, right? We find a few friends here and there, but it may be very fragmented, or one student is doing a lot of advocacy and then they graduate and all of that institutional knowledge leaves, right? And then the next students who are experiencing that same problem might feel like they have to kind of reinvent the wheel, start again, begin the advocacy from where they, from the ground up. And having a committee, having a structure for students to work with each other gives us more of a longitudinal way of making change. So that way we can have documents showing what work has been done, who have we been meeting with, who has been helpful when we've been meeting, what have we asked for, all kinds of ways in which we can collectively share knowledge and document our progress. Some of the other things that colleges can be helpful with is for staff, faculty to use their institutional power, their access to help students get meetings, to bring student issues to their colleagues and to really uplift our voices, right? There's a lot of issues, I think, that staff and faculty might not be aware of that students are experiencing on the daily. And so when you listen to us, we can tell you like, hey, every time I get a text from the student health and counseling services, it uses my dead name or like the name that trans people may choose to no longer use, right? It may be their given name and they've chosen a new name, right? And even if it's input into a system that does account for preferred name, maybe some instances it's not using the preferred name. And that was my experience at UCLA. I was finally getting access to the student health and counseling services, and it just wasn't using my name, and it just made me feel very uncomfortable and unsafe and didn't want to come back to that health center, even though I really needed that health care. But it would be like, dear, and in all caps, my like old legal name, like your appointment is at this time. And I brought that up to the staff on the trans wellness team, which thankfully there was a team of administrators, staff who were trying to improve healthcare experience for trans students. But I also could have brought it up just with the director of student health and counseling services to say, hey, it's using my wrong name and this makes me feel really unsafe and uncomfortable. And they had no idea that that was happening. They thought that because the preferred name was recorded, that it was just being used. And we ultimately ended up just removing the name from a reminder. So it would just be like, hello, your next appointment is tomorrow at 1 p.m., right? And so I couldn't have done that change by myself. I had to bring it up to administration, who then brought it up with IT, and like they made that systemic change for me and for other students. And that was a very valuable thing to have, that know that I could safely come to these people and know that they would actually like bring my concerns up to everybody. I'm actually going to ask Carly to share the results of this poll just to ask. Okay, so we have mostly staff from what I just so briefly saw. I think it just disappeared. Okay, mostly staff. Oh, hello, 4 students. But yeah, so I'll tailor this a little bit more towards staff. Thank you, Carly, for running that poll, and thank you everyone for coming. But yeah, just really, giving space for students. For example, sometimes students, we would just have like hangout nights. And so like booking a room, like a conference room, or just like booking a room for students to be able to hang out. We would like have hangout nights for queer and trans students of color. It would be like in the evening. So we just come to campus and like do arts and crafts. Like we didn't need to have like advocacy that we were working on, right? Sometimes it's really hard. Students we're paying a lot of money to go to school, but we have so many barriers that sometimes we feel like we have to be doing all of this advocacy work, or we have to be, fighting for our like right to be in the classroom, and it's exhausting. And it's important to make space for us so that we can just like be, so we can just be students, we can be comfortable, be safe. And I think that this can be done in really any kind of setting. Like you don't have to work at an LGBTQ center in order to give a space for students to be comfortable, right? Like some of the like centers that I accessed on campus and found really supportive and kind people were through like the Scholarship Resource Center. I went there in my first year and I was like, I really need to find funding for myself. And they helped me find a lot of scholarships for LGBTQ students. And this gave me a lot of like financial independence, which was really empowering, really helped me be able to move forward in my life and my transition safely. The financial aid office, like as scary as they were, I met with one counselor who was really kind, very supportive, helped me walk through a lot of processes. Professors and TAs, right? I had some wonderful professors and wonderful TAs who were incredibly supportive, would help advocate for me with regards to like course material, or just like ensure that they were using the correct name and asking for pronouns. Student health and counseling services, they had one provider who was doing most of the trans healthcare, and I felt very safe and comfortable talking with her. And anytime I needed other care from like other providers, I would really ask her specifically, like, who would you recommend, rather than going to like the women's health and going for a pap smear with a provider I had no idea if they were trans friendly. I would ask her and she would say, I would recommend my colleague so-and-so, and I would feel more safe and more comfortable knowing that she trusts this person, I trust her, I'm going to go see this person and hopefully I'll have a good experience. And I did have a good experience because of that referral. Financial wellness program, right? I met with someone who helped me figure out budgeting and stuff like that, and was like very incredibly kind and understanding of this financial situation that I was in when I was needing to become independent for myself. And also just like student organization advisors, right? Often we need like a faculty or a staff person to be an advisor for student org. So just like, and often they don't have to be very involved, right? Like you just sign something, allow students to have that space, that platform on campus, and give themselves like access to funding on campus for events, or be able to advertise and get spaces out there. Like that can be really, really helpful with giving us space to be ourselves on campus. Yeah, but I really think that staff and faculty can really ally themselves with students and give us more like platforms and more space to just be students. We're spending a lot of time and money to be students, and I think it's really important that we don't feel this incredible pressure and incredible difficulty accessing spaces where we can go to school, focus on that, and not have to worry about so many other things. I know that, I attended school in California, which is incredibly safe compared to a lot of other states. And that was something that I didn't have to worry about as much. But, you know, even with a lot of legal limitations, it's very easy to create just a small social space for us to be ourselves, to like not have to hide ourselves. I think it can be really scary for students to know that they aren't safe in classroom settings, they aren't safe on campus. And so for us to be able to kind of sit down and unmask and just like let go of all of the extra stressors that we carry can be really great, even if it's just for like an hour a week, right? I know there's a lot of limitations with regards to states. And so it's really special to be able to have small spaces where we can speak.
Thank you so much, Kai, for all of those very concrete things that universities can do. Before I open it up to the entire panel, I have a quick question for Shayna. And just a few points. I know we have proposed Title IX changes coming up. What are the proposed Title IX changes? How will they impact the experience of trans students in athletics and higher education? And why are there differing opinions on these proposed changes?
Great question. Thanks, Annie. Yeah, I will try to do this as quickly as possible, but essentially, so Title IX is a statute that already exists that prohibits sex discrimination in education. The Biden administration has issued a proposed rule or regulation interpreting that to address trans students' participation in sports. And essentially, the rule says that schools basically have to have a really good reason if they're going to be limiting or denying trans students' ability to participate in sports consistent with their gender identity. Basically, they have to show that any regulation would be substantially related to the achievement of an important educational objective. And so, the rule, a lot of advocates are interpreting to mean that blanket bans on trans students' participation in sports should not stand. Any regulations that rely on sex stereotypes should not stand. But that said, I think it's not as strong or as explicit as many of us would like in terms of, making clear to states or perhaps subsequent administrations that, really any regulations that limit or deny trans students from participating in athletics amount to sex discrimination and should not be able to, stand under Title IX. So, I think there's sort of been differing views even among the LGBT community about, whether this rule is helpful or harmful, in total. I think, everyone should feel free to formulate their own, opinions about it. And, regardless, I think it's important just for the department to hear from people that they do support trans students and they support trans students' ability to participate in sports. And so there is an open comment period. Anyone in the public can submit a comment on the proposed rule until May 15th. So I encourage anyone to do that and to write and include your own, perspectives and stories on why this is important to you. So the department can hear from as many people who are supportive of trans students as possible.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shayna. In an effort to ensure that we have time for participant questions, we're going to skip to a general question. If I could ask each of my panelists, what are your top 3 or a couple more concrete suggestions that universities can do to support trans and non-binary students? What should the takeaway be from today?
Right. I will jump in with 2. One schools should catalog what they're already doing for trans and LGBTQ students and advertise it. Lots of students don't know what resources exist, and then use that as your benchmark for making progress to move forward. Number two, lots of students, about a third of LGBTQ students, are going to school to get away from their families. Half of trans students have federal financial loans. So many students, particularly during the pandemic, lost student housing and had a very difficult time keeping up with school. So trans students need economic support and resources from the university related to housing, food, and even the support of peer socialization. As Kai gave this beautiful example when we were talking about panel prep. And he said, you know, we might not have a place to go for holidays. We might not necessarily want to go to a professor's house for dinner because that can be kind of weird. But if the school can give us money so we can buy our own food and make our own meals together, that supports us in having community. And that's what we need. So I just want to, you know, support schools and making sure there are pots of money available to trans students to support socializing. And for faculty, as Kai illustrated, students have to spend so much energy advocating for themselves and trying to change policies and experience all the stresses of the world at school and so forth. So to the extent that you can offer course assignments that allow people to be engaged in science and activism together to make change and get course credit for that with your mentorship, I would suggest trying to have some more practical action-oriented assignments embedded within your curriculum so that our trans and other LGBTQ students don't have to go do all of this on their own time. Thanks.
On top of that, I would add two things. Eliminate the gender binary every place. Easier said than done, but really important. And the second thing is support. That a lot of trans and non-binary students don't feel a sense of belonging at their campuses. They need to feel a sense of belonging someplace that they're going to be able to survive there and be able to complete their degrees and stay mentally healthy. So colleges need to provide support groups, ways for trans and non-binary students to meet each other and feel a sense of belonging. That could be in a support group, LGBTQ plus center, but they need to have some place where they have a support network, people who are there for them, because they're going to experience discrimination on campus. They need to have some place to go where they can be able to feel like they're home, have a community.
I mean, there's so many things that people can do to support students. I really would echo what Gareth and Jenny have already said. Financial support is really important, right? For me, that in the forms of like a scholarship resource center. I met with someone, we just like sat down and work on scholarships, or I met with financial aid and they walked me through the process of becoming financially independent from my parents, which I very much needed for my own mental health and safety. But also just to like sit down and like know what's up with like loans, scholarships, how much funding could I get from the university, grants. I didn't know that it was possible for me to get grants from the university until I really sat down and met with someone. And the case manager also really helped me with that process. Creating spaces for us, right? Like I said, like that can just look like booking a room and letting students advertise that and meet in that room to have social space. And also like legal services, right? At UCLA, we were able to get legal services to come and do workshops for like name and gender marker changes. And they did those for free because otherwise students have to pay a little bit of money to go see student legal services. But to make it much more accessible and friendly for students to come and just like get their paperwork done so they can go file it, because it's a huge and intimidating process to do that. Even when we are in spaces that are safe and comfortable and have that. And it's also expensive to change your name and gender marker. So, walking us through like, how do you fill out the fee waiver and all kinds of things, those are really important as well. And also, I think housing is a really difficult place, right? At UCLA, we had to request gender inclusive housing, like you'd have to email someone and then you'd have to find roommates and you'd have to work it out and they'd have to place you. And it was this whole process when I first started. And then when I graduated, they actually integrated it into the normal like housing selection system. And you just check a box that you're interested in gender inclusive housing and you could just request your roommates. And that made it so much easier. So integrating things into systems can be so much better, right? Like we were also able to remove student legal names from IDs. As Jenny mentioned, they're not legal documents, right? I could have the exact same legal name as another student, but the unique identifier is the student ID number. And so there's no need to have someone's legal name on there. It just matters to have the name that you go by. And so also integrating that into data systems for like classrooms, right? I remember one time, showing up to a chemistry class for the first time and the TA called out during attendance my legal name and I did not feel comfortable like saying, hey, I'm here. So I had to go talk to her after the class and say, that's not my name. My name is Kai. And I shouldn't have to do that, right? So advocating for us to just have your name, just have the chosen name that you go by. So we don't have to do the additional work. I used to email every single instructor, every single quarter to be like, my name is Kai, it's not this, and I shouldn't have to do that.
Thank you, Kai. Shayna.
Yeah, I mean, just echoing everything everyone already said. I think, as Kai said, there's so many things that students deal with that may not even occur to staff or administrators, like providing an avenue for students to communicate that, whether it's having listening sessions with students or just clear avenues where students can communicate those things to improve processes. As individuals, as someone who teaches students as well, just small changes you can make yourself. Like I email all of my students before class and have them send me their names and pronouns, so I'm not going off a list that a school sends me. Obviously there are ways that people higher up than me can change their systems to be better as well, but there are steps that you can take as an individual to try to improve that.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists today. We had amazing questions in the chat and just plain ran out of time. So perhaps this will inspire a follow-up. So thank you so much to our panelists. I appreciate so much your time and expertise. And with that, I'll hand it over to Kareth.
Thank you, Annie, for your excellent moderation job. Thank you, panelists. Thank you, audience, for coming and spending an hour with us. My email is in the chat. If you have follow-up questions, something that we weren't able to get to today, please let me know. I'll try to support you one-on-one or connect you with other folks who know something more than I do. Thank you, and have a good afternoon.